Hey Ding Dongs, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
And this is Explain It to Jamie, the political comedy podcast in which I, Jamie, a politically innocent but curious young man, have the complicated political happenings of the world explained to him by his fantastic friend, Richard Lamb.
Oh my God, I'm not just a good friend anymore, guys. I'm a fantastic friend.
Moving up in the world.
I've upgraded. I'm climbing the ranks.
Yeah, congratulations.
Soon I'll have a corner office in Jamie Friendship Tower.
Oh, let's not get too big for your britches, Richard. You still got to work your way out of the mailroom.
That's true. And actually, I'll probably be glad I live in the mailroom when it comes to Jamie Friendship Tower at 9/11.
Yeah.
Too soon? Too soon? Too soon? Definitely too soon.
Yeah. How you doing, Rick?
I'm doing okay, man. I'm doing okay.
You're good. How you doing, Dolores?
Glad to hear it, Beater. Good work. Good work. Yeah, Dolores and I were hard at work researching this week's episode. So Jamie, what is it that you've informed me in advance that you want to know this week, except now I'm going to ask it to you spontaneously like I'm just doing this all off the dome. Jamie, what do you want to know about this week? Just, pick the topic.
Well, really, Richard, I'm glad you asked. I want to talk about the UN.
Oh. UN.
Yeah, the UN, the United Nations.
Oh, I thought when you said this, you were asking me about the yuan, the Chinese currency.
Do you know? Is that what you researched?
No. No, I didn't. I just procrastinated.
Okay, well, maybe we'll do the yuan next week.
Yeah, okay, great.
And that will be our most under-listened episode by a long shot. I'm just predicting.
It's a market of 1 billion people, JB. Yeah. You got to be a little more optimistic about those numbers.
Yeah, you're right.
No, the UN, the United Nations.
The United Nations. The nations after being united. United being the word to describe the nations as they come together as nations.
Oh my God. Are you Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the United Nations? Because that was some inside baseball you just dropped on us.
Well, what can I say? Either I know everything about the United Nations or I haven't slept in 21 hours.
Let's find out which one it is after the theme song. Wow!
I haven't slept in 21 hours.
Okay, so Jamie, I feel like we already have a pretty good grasp on your knowledge base, but what do you think the United Nations is? What do you know about the United Nations?
The United Nations is, of course, a collective of governments that is famous for solving big mega disputes, such as the time that the Trade Republic blockaded Naboo and causing horrible trouble in the Galactic Republic, and Princess Amidala had to go to the Galactic Senate and plead her case, and the UN oversaw all of that.
That's right. That's right. You're right. Yeah. I mean, to this day, General Mace Windu's mishandling of the genocide in Rwanda continues to haunt international relations and interventionist theory.
That's right.
No, Jamie, that's the Republic from Star Wars. Yeah. You silly guy.
Yeah, many of you may be sitting there thinking, "Wow, he knew a lot about the Phantom Menace." The first episode 1.
Don't pretend like you don't know a lot about the Phantom Menace, listener.
Yeah.
We all fucking watched that shit. Even we knew it was bad, eagerly. But we still lapped it up.
100%.
Fucking pod races and shit. I still know that other dude's name is Sebulba. That's the guy Anakin races against in the pod race.
Sebulba.
His name is I know that. That's a fact I know.
Yeah.
That's in my head.
Heck sure. What did he call Anakin? He was like a skin sack or something like that.
I don't think he called him a skin sack.
He had some sort of like a Star Warsy racist term for him, wasn't it? Like,
sure.
Yeah, peach child.
Whoa! Wow.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Racism in Star Wars is really funny because, like, it's totally cool. Like, you know, it's like funny world building for like some weird like lizard ass alien to call a human like blood pudding. But then, like, there's like in that same movie, there's like clearly Asian aliens that are like so racist, and no one ever even like bats an eye when the alien who like looks like its entire face is like a melted wax figure of a real alien is like, oh, the Jedi who are taking apart our spaceship. Like that's just cool. Like no one's gonna make a reference to that.
Yeah, man. Just goes to show racism's okay so long as nobody's the race you're making fun of.
Again, a market of 1 billion people. Okay, no. Let's get back to reality. Oh, there goes gravity.
Well, there goes gravity.
Yeah. Okay, so the United Nations, Jamie.
Yes.
Is an international organization.
I think you mispronounced intergalactic.
Yeah. Okay. No, so the United Nations is like a group of countries that all got together after World War II and were like, hey, that sucked. Let's not do that again, please, if we can help it. And everyone was like, even though they were not super cool with each other at the time, they were like, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Just because we really don't like each other, I think we can all agree not to do that World War II thing again. Because remember, we've alluded to this a few times, and I do think we should do a bit of a World War II history ep, or maybe multiple ones, because there's a lot. It was the whole world. But literally the whole world was at war, pretty much. 50 million people died. Right. Tons of devastation. Refugees everywhere. Countries devastated, new countries created. It was like crazy time for everybody. And so the United Nations was formed. You probably know that there was like a first crack at the United Nations after World War I called the League of Nations. Yeah. But the League of Nations ultimately failed to do its one job, which was stop World War II from happening.
Right.
Failed pretty hard.
And when it failed, it became a much smaller group called the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
That's right. It's really a couple steps down from nationhood when you're just several extraordinary gentlemen. Yeah.
Yeah, 21 hours I haven't slept in, ladies and gentlemen.
Fun bit of trivia. Sean Connery was the only entity to be considered both an extraordinary gentleman and an entire nation in the original League of Nations. Connery Stan. Okay, so let's chat a bit about the League of Nations. So both the League of Nations and the UN had the same goal. The goal is to keep international peace and peace among nations. And remember too that in 1919, which is when World War I ends and we start trying to make the League of Nations, the idea of a nation is still kind of like a new idea, right? Nations as we know them now really only started to exist in like the late 1700s. And it was only because before that, like if you're a French peasant, you didn't consider yourself like under the monarchy, you didn't consider yourself like the same as like a French noble. Like right. You had no concept of like, oh, because we're all French people, we have something in common that we should fight for and that defines us and we have common interests. Right. Back in the day, it was like the nobles had more in common with each other, like a German noble and a Russian noble and a French noble. They saw each other more as peers, and the peasants were just peasants.
Right, you're just beholden to the people who run your property or whatever.
Exactly. It's with the French Revolution and the American Revolution that we really start seeing these people are like, no, we're this group of people, we're a state, we have an interest as a group of people who live in a place, right?
Right. And like the breakdown of like the Austrian Empire.
Exactly. Like Germany doesn't even become a country until the late 1800s.
Austrian Empire? Ottoman Empire?
The Ottoman Empire at the time, yeah. Austro-Hungarian Empire falls apart in World War I, right? The Ottoman Empire is Turkey. Yeah. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is like the Germanic Empire. But the independent state of Germany is only created in like the 1870s. So by the end of World War I, Germany as a country is only like 40, 50 years old. Right? So nations are new.
Yeah, that kind of blows my mind in that play Amadeus when they're like, they're talking because they're like, well, there's a guy from Italy, there's a guy from Germany, and they're all hanging out in the Austrian emperor's palace talking about music. And I always like read that and was like, that's like interestingly progressive. Also, they say racist shit about each other all the time.
And also remember too that like nobles back in the day would intermarry as like a form of diplomacy. So like the British Queen would be German.
Right.
Like she's like a German person. She doesn't even, she might not even speak really English. Right. Or like everyone spoke French. Like Russian nobles spoke French better than they spoke Russian. Russian was like the language that peasants spoke. French was the language of international diplomacy through the 19th century. Again, it's just another thing that like heightens how removed these people were from each other.
Right.
Anyway, so the nation is a new idea, and there's thought that we need to prevent World War I from happening again. One of the things that really caused World War I to explode was the fact that there were all these like secret alliances that nobody knew about before World War I. So like what I mean is that like there were all these like under the table alliances between countries, so that like Britain was pledged to defend France, and like Russia was pledged, and like Austria-Hungary was pledged to defend Germany, and the Ottoman Empire was pledged to defend Germany. So when France and Austria went to war, suddenly Britain and Russia and Germany, like all these other countries, were suddenly all at war with each other. And like when they first started the war, none of them knew that many countries were about to be at war.
Right. It's like when in high school when Brittany slept with Tyler, and Tyler was actually dating Stephanie, and Stephanie didn't realize that Brittany had done that.
Sounds like your high school needed a league of players to sort out all that confusion on the sexual playground.
We really did.
Yeah.
We could have. Well, we did form one.
Developed pretty quickly into a league of extraordinary gentlemen, though.
Yeah, and a league of STIs.
Whoa. That's actually like a measurement of mass of STIs. A league. It's above a ton.
Yeah.
But below a crab. So part of the reason the League of Nations is formed is to kind of bring all of this international communication into one place that's like formal. And so the idea is that nations basically agree to work out their problems diplomatically and to all have kind of a collective sense of responsibility for peace, and a kind of collective system of rules that they'll all agree to abide by, and agree to follow like punishment if they break those rules in ways that aren't war, right? That's the main thing. It's like, let's do everything we can to all agree that war is bad for everyone. World War I, remember, was like a total butcher show also. Like it was pointless slaughter. Like so many millions of lives wasted because of like the butchery of World War I.
Right.
And also the world was horrified with like chemical weapons for the first time and stuff like that, and new technology in war. Anyway, so they tried to make this League of Nations to prevent war from happening again. The League of Nations, the original one, had a lot of problems. The first of which was that it was basically considered to be like a league of the people who won World War I dictating to everybody else. As examples of this, like Germany was not allowed to join the League of Nations. They're like, because you started it.
Right.
That's like was their people's reasons, right? So they weren't allowed to join until like 5 years later, when they were already pretty fucked up from sanctions and having to pay reparations to Britain and France. America did not join the League of Nations, even though President Woodrow Wilson was like one of the main architects of the League of Nations. The American Congress did not vote to ratify.
Why?
I think they thought that they would be too beholden to international systems, and they'd have too much obligation to countries that aren't America. They'd be too tied to other countries. Remember, we talked about this on our last climate change episode, how America doesn't like to be responsible, right? It doesn't like to feel like its affairs are in other countries' control, and that's kind of like an all or nothing condition for America to sign on to stuff.
So very, very similar to how Barack Obama took off and signed the Paris Agreement and like made all these deals, and then came back and everyone was no, not the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto
Protocol.
So when Clinton went off to do the Kyoto Protocol, helped make it, came back,
Congress,
and Congress shut it down.
Exactly,
Exactly
like that.
the same.
Exactly the same thing.
Interesting.
So the League of Nations was a little bit doomed from the very beginning. Part of the other problem was that because in the way they structured the League of Nations, you needed a unanimous vote of everybody who was in it to do anything. And at the time, there weren't that many countries in it. I think there were like 15 or 20. But the problem was all of them had just enough different interests that it was incredibly, incredibly difficult to let any of them do anything. And they kind of bungled all of their first major challenges, which included stuff like the Japanese invaded Manchuria, right? This is one of the precursor events to World War I. And when the League of Nations was like, no, you can't do that, Japan was like, well, fuck you guys. They left the League of Nations. And then Spain left when they started bombing their own people, and the League of Nations kind of dithered about it, right? And Germany left when Hitler came to power in 1933. And the failure of the League of Nations to act decisively in the early warning stages of World War II is because of the way it was set up, because it needed so much consensus to do everything, but these nations don't all want to do exactly the same thing. It couldn't really do anything. And so the League of Nations being set up that way is kind of partly to blame for what's called appeasement, which is when Hitler was coming to power, everyone knew he was trouble. The strategy of the British Prime Minister Wilt Chamberlain was like, it's okay, let's just give him some of what he wants, he'll stop eventually, right? Which, super wrong. Yeah. It was very incorrect.
As it turned out.
So that's the failure of the League of Nations. It basically just did not stop World War II at all.
Is Wilt Chamberlain the same guy who played in the NBA and
Holy
slept,
shit.
And slept
I
with
said
like...
Wilt Chamberlain. I meant Neville Chamberlain. Oh man, fucking Prime Minister Wilt Chamberlain would not have done appeasement,
slept
you guys.
with like 750 women.
He would have gone dick first into Germany. Like, you want to talk about the bombing of Dresden? Wait till you see what Wilt Chamberlain did with his wang.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, sorry, Neville Chamberlain. That's so
Neville
funny.
Chamberlain.
If you already have your email client open and are busy writing me an email about how I said Wilt Chamberlain, you can rest assured we got to that right away.
Yeah.
Wilt Chamberlain. Fuck, that's funny.
That's really good.
Okay, so fast forward. It's after World War II.
Sure.
We're going to try again now to build this nation building thing, and we learn from the lessons of the first time. So this time, they try to create the United Nations again. This time, they don't exclude anyone from joining, and at the very beginning of the United Nations, there's about 50 nations that join. Eventually, that number grows and grows kind of throughout the early years, and right now it's at 193 nations.
How many nations are there total?
Like 195 or 6. Like we're pretty close to everybody.
Who's not in there?
That's a great question. I should look that up, and I will right now. There's only 3 countries that are not in the UN. Those 3 countries are Kosovo, Palestine, and Vatican City.
Huh.
So these are generally states that, I mean, the Vatican maybe is just neutral, like it doesn't want to join and act as a nation. Kosovo and Palestine, I think, are both, their nation status is contested by countries that are in the UN, right? Israel doesn't think Palestine's a country, and Kosovo is splintered off from other Eastern European countries, right? So
Israel doesn't think Palestine's a country?
No.
Isn't Palestine older than Israel?
Jamie, you are putting us on some radars right now with what you're saying. We just got put on yet another CSIS list because you saying this stuff. We have not done an Israel-Palestine episode yet. We definitely will, and we definitely should.
Right.
In a word, yes. Okay. Like, in the most simple term, yes, it is. The thing is, the territory that was called Palestine was partitioned and given to Israel in the part of the post-World War II peace process.
Right. So not only did we just ping a CSIS thing, but we also pinged like a Google alert for Mel Gibson.
Yeah, that's right. Mel Gibson's gonna fucking drive here in his Tesla and just ruthlessly lay into both of us on an extreme racial tirade. Actually, isn't he anti-Semitic? Wouldn't he like us if we said?
Yeah. No, he'd come over and
he'd come over and hang out with us,
slap us on the back, and be like, "Oh, finally, people that are fucking talking my language."
Oh God, great! I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
We're gonna be on Rebel Media soon because of this.
Heck yeah. That's the goal.
No, basically,
wasn't that always the goal?
Basically, Palestinian people who were already there when the State of Israel was created by the victorious powers in World War II wanted to keep living there, and Israel doesn't recognize them as having their own country. It's basically the whole it's like 80% of the problem there.
Right.
Like,
Right.
let's just say it's like a really big part of the problem there. And so we'll get into why that is when we do Israel-Palestine. Let's not do it now because like there is a quivering can of worms just itching to burst open on this table right now.
Okay.
So basically all the countries in the world are in the UN now. Here's what they did differently. Instead of having like one big thing, they partitioned up the responsibilities of the United Nations into several different like sub-organizations. So there's the main thing in the UN is called the UN General Assembly. You've probably heard of this. And the UN General Assembly is like the parliament of the UN or whatever, where it's like all the countries have at least up to 5 representatives in the UN General Assembly. That's where every country can
Gets
talk
together,
about
talk about shit.
They talk about what's bothering them.
Like in the
talk about
Phantom
problem.
Menace when
It's
Queen,
exactly
when Queen Amidala shows up and like
honestly,
E.T.'s
it
there
is
and
like
everybody.
that. It is, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. So that's that thing where that's where like, you know, you can get up, you could talk about it's kind of like AA, I guess. You get up, you talk about what your problems are.
Yeah.
You talk about collective solutions, collective action that wants to be taken.
Can you imagine if the United Nations was also anonymous?
You don't know what country it is, but you have to guess. It's
Yeah.
like, I have this problem where this small group of people inside my country keep wanting to be called a country, even I know they were there first, but I just don't want them to recognize them. I'm not saying who I am.
Canada.
Yeah. I was saying Israel.
Oh.
I was called
Also
back in.
Canada.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, probably applies to many different groups of people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the main thing, and that's for countries to air their specific kind of grievances, right? But the UN General Assembly isn't empowered to like do everything, right? This is the key change. Most of the actual concrete like force and power of the UN is concentrated in the UN Security Council, which is a different thing. And you've also probably heard of this.
Yes. This is the Security Council is the one with the vetoes.
Yeah, so there are 15 seats on the UN Security Council. 5 of them are permanent seats. They belong to the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. Those 5 countries always get a seat at the table.
Why?
Because they started it. Because they were there at the beginning, and the only reason all of them would sign on is if they got this spot.
Right.
Right? Because remember, the U.S. doesn't sign on unless if it's going to be if some other country is going to be dictating, have power over it, telling them what to do, the U.S. will not sign on.
Right.
And so they knew that from before, and so they made sure they figured it's better to have a fucked up weird version of this than to have no version at all, because we don't want World War III. We still don't want it. And so they made this compromise version where they gave all those 5 countries a veto. So there's 10 other seats, obviously, because there's 15 total. Every 2 years, those 10 other seats are elected in from the rest of the countries in the UN. So every 10 years, it changes.
Okay.
Last time Canada was on the UN Security Council in the mid-2000s, we tried to change that rule, but we failed.
Try to change the permanent 5-seat rule.
Yeah, we tried to get more permanent seats. More people to have permanent seats on the Security Council.
Well, we wanted
change the
more
terms.
permanent
exactly.
seats. Why doesn't everybody get a seat?
That's a good question. It's because they're trying to find a balance between effectiveness and representation.
Right.
So if you have too many seats at the table, you
Too
can't
many
get anything done.
voices,
And
Too
there
many
is
chefs making
that's
soup
right.
or whatever.
And
the
there's
saying.
like region and who gets the seats are nominated by regions. So like the EU will nominate seats for the Security Council, other than Britain and France, and then the Arab League will nominate seats. The African Union will nominate seats, right? So there is like a version of everyone kind of getting their say. After your 2 years are done, you can't do another term in a row, so it does have to keep rotating between the different countries and the different regions.
And you can't hold 2 seats, I'm sure.
You cannot hold 2 seats.
So like the U.S.
Exactly.
couldn't-
Each country can only hold 1 seat. So to some extent, there's like a democratic element, right? Where it's like this country's turn. It's Belgium's turn to be on the Security Council. It's Italy's turn. You know, like there's some of that negotiating happening within each region.
Right. And does everybody on the Security Council have a veto, or is
No.
it just the permanent 5?
Only the 5. That's what the rule is. You need like a majority rule and all 5 of the originals. And like you need a majority vote that includes the 5 original countries, right? There are ways around this. The main way being that if you abstain from voting, like if you don't vote at all, it doesn't count as a veto. So if there's for some reason a country hasn't shown up or is boycotting the UN, you can pass stuff that maybe they would veto if they showed up.
Right. So you could like slash the tires on their private jet. So they just don't get there.
Hey, that's a good one. I'm sure. Maybe I don't know. I'm sure they could just call in or something. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they have to physically be there. I mean, algorithms are getting real good these days.
Yeah, man.
So the UN Security Council can do all sorts of stuff. It's where kind of like the real shit happens. So like if the UN, like here's an example. The UN General Assembly will be like, yo, I'm Richard Stan and Jamie Stan's been like driving trucks full of poop across my border and dumping all their poop in my country. I don't like it.
Yeah.
And then so in the General Assembly they'd be like, yeah, we condemn the poop dumping of Jamie Stan. It's unhealthy. And so then once we've condemned it, we have to go to the Security Council and be like, okay, do something about it. And the Security Council then has to be like, okay, Jamie Stan and Richard Stan, we're going to send you guys to mediation. So we're going to get Jamie and Richard in a room with a third person and he's going to talk through this poop thing and see if we can find a solution that you both agree to. Right? And again, we talked about this also last time on our climate change episode, but there is with stuff that's like not an urgent violent conflict, there is like a peer pressure element where it's like, let's make this thing fucking work, guys. Let's figure that, like you want to find a solution. Like there's a pressure from all the nations to find diplomatic solutions to problems because nobody wants war again.
Right. Well, speak for yourself. People in my country are pooping at a rate that we cannot control. We need to get rid of it.
So that's the kind of thing you do. And then if you keep dumping the poop, if you refuse to mediate, or find a diplomatic solution,
which I do,
then I would go to the UN Security Council again and be like, okay, we need a military solution. Either now we can impose sanctions on you, right? So we can say like, okay, you like that poop so much? Well, we're cutting off your brand imports. You get all your imports from the United States. Well, the US is saying no one sells brand at Jamie Stan anymore.
Right.
Let's see you poop now, motherfuckers. So that's like
this
one
has
of
been my favorite divergence that we have ever done on this podcast.
That's one of the options. And then also, if a step above that would be military blockade. So it's like not only
no pun intended.
Not only are we not sending you brand, we're gonna fucking put navies at all your ports and on troops on your borders and make sure nothing gets in.
Right.
Or only the shit we want gets in.
Right.
So that's going to put a lot of pressure on you, especially if Jamie Stan's not an oil producing nation, for example. That can really cause a lot of trouble.
Right. Little do you know that I am importing gallons and gallons of Metamucil from North Korea.
Oh shit! Illegally getting around that blockade.
That's right.
Yeah.
Push our way right through there.
And then finally, if the blockade doesn't work, we can escalate to a full military peacekeeping intervention.
Right.
Well, this can be a peacekeeping mission, or it can be like an interventionist strike. Right. They're different things.
And countries donate troops to the UN.
That's right. And this was one of the other things we learned from the League of Nations. With the League of Nations, one of the problems was that whenever anything needed to happen fast with like military intervention, nobody was ready to go to war that fast. So we realized that there needed to be kind of like a constant state of military alertness among contributor nations.
Right.
And generally speaking, different nations will donate different amounts of troops to different missions.
Right. And if they work for the UN, they wear the blue hats?
That's right, the blue helmets. This was actually, Canada is a big UN peacekeeper. And Canada has found over the years peacekeeping is a way for it to use its relatively small military, but like well-trained and decently equipped military to have a punch above its weight in the international community. Right. So when Canada takes a big leadership role on a UN peacekeeping mission, it kind of earns us a lot of capital and credibility with everybody else. And so Canada gets a lot of bang for its buck out of using its military and peacekeeping missions, at least with international relations and stuff like that.
Right.
Canada's a lot more of like a world player than it should be because of its size, right? It's a pretty small country by population and by economy and stuff like that.
And relatively small military.
Yeah, but because it's diplomatically active and because it occupies a unique position between the US and Britain, we are a more powerful nation than we are on the books because of stuff like that.
Right. Right.
Of course, the entire concept of UN peacekeeping was invented by a Canadian, Lester B. Pearson, who became the prime minister, but at the time was the minister of state of like foreign affairs under Louis Saint Laurent.
Right. And king of an airport.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. King of the Toronto airport. Yeah, and this was during the Suez Canal Crisis, which is like a kind of like historical Cold War footnote in many other countries' history books, but in Canada is like a huge entire unit you do because it's when Canada invented UN peacekeeping. It's a stupid story. It's like a totally idiotic thing that happened. But like basically Israel was a new country.
Is it stupider than one country importing poop into another country illegally?
It's like close. It's like a bit of a goof, like it's a bit of a dumb story.
Right.
So like the Suez Canal is this thing in Egypt. It connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. So basically like it's like the shortest path through Africa to get like to get to like the Persian Gulf and stuff like that, right? Like you can go like it's this canal, this like fake river, right? That's cut. It's like cuts a channel straight from the Mediterranean, which links directly to Europe, and then into like the Arab world, like the other side of the Arab, like the eastern part of the Arab world.
Right.
And Britain helped build it in the 19th century. A private British company basically paid to build it, even though it's in Egypt. And then this British company was like running it and making money off of boats going through it. And so in 1956, Egypt was like, we're sick of this. We own this now. And they nationalized the Suez Canal. So they took it they're like, this shit is in Egypt. You guys have controlled it for almost 100 years. We control it now. Sorry. Like this President Nasser was the guy's name. And President Nasser nationalized the canal. And he's like, nothing changes. We're just going to get the money from this now. Right. Sorry. And Britain was really pissed about this. And so Britain, France, and Israel kind of conspired together. All of them wanted to attack Egypt for different reasons. And they sort of conspired together to like basically send their armies in and take the canal. So Israel invaded Egypt and it took the canal by force, and Egypt came, and like the canal was kind of like the standoff point. And then America got really pissed off at Britain and France for attacking, basically sending troops in without consulting them. And so they threatened things were really looking bad diplomatically between America and France and Britain, and everyone was looking for kind of a graceful way out of this shitty military standoff over the Suez Canal. So Lester B. Pearson invented the idea that the UN would send in a neutral force of soldiers to make sure everyone left okay, and to make it not look like Britain and France were running away.
Right.
Literally. So it's like, no, it's okay. There's a neutral force here. Britain and France aren't running away. We're just replacing them, and now we'll gracefully do our exit.
And instead of guns, the UN soldiers just go out with their hands.
Pepsi cans.
Yeah, with Pepsi cans.
They hand
and they
cans
go,
of Pepsi.
whoa, 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 whoa,
Yeah.
whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa,
Yeah,
whoa,
they
whoa.
just do that. You're joking, but honestly, you're not wrong in a lot of ways. When UN soldiers are sent in on peacekeeping missions, they are really, really heavily constrained in when they can use force and when they can fight back and use violence at all, and when
Like
they
it's
can't.
only when they're getting shot at, isn't that?
Well,
isn't
and
that right?
sometimes not even then, or like it wasn't clear for a long time. Here, Okay, so let me do a little digression on this. So what are the different kinds of interventions? The first major thing the UN ever did was the Korean War, which we've talked about in our North Korea episode, which you should go listen to. But basically, in 1950, in Korea, North Korea fully invaded and attempted to seize South Korea. And there was never a formal declaration of war against North Korea by any other international countries outside the Korean Peninsula. What happened was the whole Korean War was technically like a UN police intervention because North Korea was like breaching international law. So now it's a UN mission. It was like 95% American troops that ended up going in because America really wanted to get on top of this. And it was obviously commanded by General MacArthur, who was a hero of World War II. And an insane person also. It always bears repeating. Like he was fucking crazy.
Right.
So that was like a full war, right? That was a war in everything but name. Congress never technically declared war, but that was a war.
This is the Korean War.
Yeah, that's right.
So wait, so the Korean War, because I know the Korean War is sort of famous, the states were involved in it, as you said.
Yeah.
the states were acting on behalf of the UN.
That was technically a mixed nation UN mission. Canada was in the Korean War too.
I didn't know
But
that.
again, like I said, the troop makeup was like 95% American troops on the ground, 85% American transports and logistics and stuff like that, 80% American officers and like it was like heavily American mission, but it was technically a UN intervention. Yeah. So that's like a war the UN fought, right? The other side of that is peacekeeping. And you go in, UN sends in peacekeepers only in specific situations, generally to like, if there's two parties that are fighting and they've reached like a ceasefire, the UN will send in peacekeepers to make sure the ceasefire actually happens okay, right? So there's like this neutral group of armed people who are just there to kind of like keep things calm as these groups who have been fighting figure out the new order of things, right? Now,
so why? Okay, maybe this is like jiggling the can of worms, but like Israel and Palestine have been fighting for like 40 years.
right.
So where the fuck is the UN?
Here's the problem. Palestine doesn't have a seat in the UN General
right.
Assembly because they're not technically recognized as a nation by several of the member states. I think they do actually have like independent observers who like come to they have like independent ambassadors who like are at the UN, who are there to do diplomacy, but they're just not technically members of the UN, but they're there. They have a presence there. But the catch is that Israel and the US have a very close ties. And the US has vetoed 36 attempts to intervene in Israel on the UN Security Council since the UN was created in 1945.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think actually the U.S. has vetoed those 36 vetoes represent more vetoes than every other veto combined by every other country.
Right.
So they've tried, but the nature of the UN means that the U.S. can block any attempts to intervene in Israel, and that's just how it is.
Huh.
Notably, the Korean War only happened because Russia at the time was boycotting the UN, and they weren't there, so they couldn't use their veto because North Korea had Russian support. Right. But because they weren't actually, they were pissed at the UN. They had withdrawn everything for a little while. The vote went there, and Russia wasn't there to vote. They technically abstained, and the Korean War went ahead. Right now.
There are the kinds of intervention there are that the UN can do is like actual like military war intervention and peacekeeping intervention and a hit show on A&E intervention.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So peacekeeping, but we were talking about how like sometimes peacekeepers can't shoot their guns or whatever.
Right.
So the classic horrible example of this is Rwanda, which you've heard about, I'm sure.
Right.
So the Rwandan genocide, what happened in Rwanda was this. So Rwanda has two major warring ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? The Hutus are like the political majority, and in the like 60s and 70s, they expelled a bunch of Tutsis into neighboring Uganda. And then in the 90s, the pissed off kids of those expelled Tutsis formed an army to go take back Rwanda. So like they had about 4,000 rebel troops, Tutsi rebel troops, came into Rwanda. There was big
laid waste.
Yeah, big. There was a war. And what the thing is about the UN, which I haven't actually mentioned yet, the UN technically isn't allowed to intervene in the domestic affairs of any country. So it recognizes as a core principle that each country is sovereign in its own borders. It has the right to do whatever the fuck it wants inside itself, and it can't intervene. So like the UN couldn't intervene in like the FLQ crisis,
right?
Because that's happening in Canada completely, right?
Right.
But if it comes out that like France is sending all these fucking weapons to the FLQ, the UN can intervene. That's an international problem.
Right.
So what happened in Rwanda was the UN was basically Rwanda was accusing Uganda, which is its neighboring country, of sending the rebels who are fighting against the Hutu government weapons. And the Ugandans were like, this isn't happening. We are not sending them weapons. Can you please send UN people to sit on the border and just say to everyone, we're not sending weapons. So that's the first UN mission in Rwanda was like 50 dudes who literally had no guns at all, who were just there to watch the border and make sure that there were no guns going across.
Right.
Then what happened was there was a ceasefire reached between the rebels and the government. The war kind of fought itself to a standstill. They went off with the UN. They got mediation. They agreed to a ceasefire. So then a small contingent of UN troops was sent in on a peacekeeping mission to make sure the ceasefire happened.
Right.
And this was the famous mission commanded by Canadian Brigadier General Romeo
Valentine
Dallaire.
St. Clair.
Valentine St. Clair. Romeo Dallaire.
Right.
Yeah, General Romeo Dallaire. He asked for 5,000.
My sister got to meet him.
He was a senator. He's he was a very interesting guy. He saw one of the worst atrocities of the late 20th century and came out of the other end a very honest man who seems to have quite a lot of integrity. I don't know. I would never ever hoped to wish anything on anybody like what he had seen. Yes, which we'll get into right now. He asked for 5,000 men. He got 2,500, and he got them very slowly. Nations were really reluctant to send troops into Rwanda, partly because the United Nations was also in an intervention in Somalia, and that was going real bad. That's Black Hawk Down. Remember that movie?
Sure do.
That's Somalia.
Right.
So that was going really badly. They didn't want to also get bogged down in Rwanda, so he only actually really started with a couple hundred troops.
The UN was trying to shut down production of Black Hawk Down.
Yeah, that's correct. Anyway, while they're in Rwanda, the first UN troops, this key thing happens where the president of Uganda, who's the guy who kind of brokered the ceasefire, who's not like a perfect figure, but he was the one in charge of the ceasefire, his plane is shot down by a rocket and he gets killed while the ceasefire is being implemented. And the people who take over are like hard-line Hutu supremacists. And so word reaches Romeo Dallaire that there's a genocide about to happen, that the Hutus, the hard-line Hutus who do not want any peace with the Tutsis, are organizing into death squads and secretly arming themselves from these huge hidden arms caches, and they're making Tutsi people like register with the government, and they're going to use that information to hunt them down and kill them. And apparently they heard Hutus bragging because of this information they could kill 1,000 Tutsis in 20 minutes. That was like the numbers that they were saying.
Whoa.
Romeo Dallaire knows this is happening. He goes to the UN. He begs for more troops to come in because they know this is about to happen now. And the UN kind of did theirs on it, right? And while it's happening, the genocide starts. And so, and it's chaos, right? Like, so Hutus are massacring Tutsis and more moderate Hutus who don't want the genocide to happen. People are being killed. Many of them are being killed with machetes, like it's like graphic and violent and brutal and terrible. 10 Belgian soldiers who are part of the UN peacekeeping mission are killed in the opening hours of the genocide beginning because they don't know what their rules of engagement are. And even though they're being shot at, they don't want to cause more they don't want to start in World War III. That's what I think is on everyone's mind. So these 10 Belgian soldiers who are like guarding this one guy gave up they surrendered to this death squad who just mass murdered them all. Right. So and they're like the main UN casualties of this mission. Part of what ends up happening is like the UN headquarters in Rwanda, like where Romeo Dallaire and his kind of 2,500 men are based, is in this one stadium, and this stadium becomes like the only safe haven for people fleeing the genocide. So as many people as they can take in and shelter in the stadium, they take them in, but they're not allowed to like go out and start saving people and like raid the arms caches because they know where the weapons are being held. They ask for permission to go raid them. They ask for permission to do all kinds of shit, but the UN doesn't give it to them. And in the end, they just kind of have to sit there and watch this genocide happen right in front of them.
Yikes. Knowing
that they're right there, but they can't do anything about it. Romeo Dallaire ends up actually quitting the mission and getting replaced, and he ends up with like severe post-traumatic stress disorder from having to do this. In the end, a stronger intervention was approved, but by that point the genocide wound down. It lasted from about the end of April to like mid-July of 1994, I believe, and in that time like 800,000 people were killed in that one country, which is not large.
Right. Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Bureaucracy, man.
Yeah. So this is like a criticism of a UN peacekeeping mission. It's severely constrained and it requires the UN Security Council to intervene, right? And at the time, other African nations were saying, don't go in. Like, we don't want to start a full shooting war here, even if there's a genocide happening, you know? Yeah, so that's kind of like part of the dynamic of it. It's an unenviable task.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so that's an example of the UN
Yeah.
kind of fumbling the ball.
Yeah.
Um,
As like an international peacekeeping organization, the UN is really imperfect. It
Right.
depends on complete consensus among 5 countries that have really different aims. And
Right.
generally speaking, one of those countries is going to have a stake in every armed conflict on the globe.
Right.
Like, the UN didn't intervene in Syria because Russia vetoed, because Russia's an ally of the Syrian government.
Right.
The UN didn't intervene in Ukraine because Russia vetoed.
right.
Right?
Right. Well, it seems to me like a lot of the maybe I don't know. It seems to me a lot of the problem is the 5 permanent seats on the Security Council with this fucking weird veto thing.
Right. But then the problem is, if you don't have that, you have the League of Nations, and then you don't have credibility, right? Like the reason every country in the world is in the UN is because those 5 countries agreed to be in the UN.
Right.
And the only reason they agreed is because they could veto everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was gonna ask like what maybe like major successes the UN has had, but I imagine a lot of the like, you know, it's sort of like a good boxing judge, right? Like the best boxing judge you've never heard of.
Yeah, well,
right? Like the
well, you
best
have heard
UN
of it.
success you've probably like it's probably like it's such a success because it never happened.
Well, there's a lot of stuff that we've missed on. We're only halfway through. We're not like, I mean, this is we've talked about like many of the most important things that people think of when they think of the UN, but we're actually only half done describing the parts of the UN. Remember I said the UN was divided up into different parts?
Right. Security Council, General Assembly.
So now after that, there's the Economic and Social Council.
Uh-huh.
So one of the other main responsibility of the UN is to be like a world leader for human rights, and to interpret the task of keeping peace as creating harmony and wellness and human rights among all people. So this is the part of the UN that deals with stuff like, you know, access to drinking water. You know, you hear of the UN dealing with that. This is the part of the UN that deals with refugees.
Mm-hmm.
This is the part of the UN that deals with climate change. And this is where you see a lot of the positive effects of the UN. Certainly there is like corruption in this part. Anytime there's money trying to go to humanitarian aid on a huge international scale, there's people who are going to funnel it off and try to do their own thing. But like, there's many successes here. UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, that's a big one, right? Like, and you remember we used to have little orange boxes on our necks in Halloween, and we get coins for UNICEF.
Yeah.
And there's the thing on the back that's like, you know, $1 feeds a village for a day.
Right.
That's like a huge success. It just gets all these
So
resources.
technically, I work for the UN
Yeah,
when I was
that's
7
right.
years old.
That's right. You fundraised for the UN. You did.
Wow.
And so, like, in a lot of these, like, human rights ways, there's successes. There's people's lives being made better. On our last climate change episode, also, we talked about how even if the Paris Accord, it doesn't itself bind things, it's really useful because it, like, centers the conversation on, like, a really tangible thing where it's like, these are the goals of fighting climate change. And now we can talk about every country's progress in these terms.
Right.
The UN does a lot of stuff like that. So it does a lot of like analyzing problems and then like condensing them into a clear declaration
Right.
that then you can use in your own country to be like, hey, have we done this UN thing
this
yet?
is where we're not good. This is where
Yeah,
we're
the
good.
UN's pointed this thing out. How are we doing? You know, like, and they do, that's right. They do a lot of like monitoring and reporting on people's progress in different areas. A good example of this is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is called UNDRIP. Like in Canada, UNDRIP basically says that like Indigenous people have the right to do basically all the stuff that they want to do in Canada. They have the right to be citizens of Canada and have their own sovereign territories, be respected about the decisions about those sovereign territories. They have the right to their languages and education in their languages. They have the right to their own systems of government that are from their traditional beliefs, and they're also entitled to the rights of citizenship of Canada. That's what that says. And lots of people are saying to Justin Trudeau, you have to implement UNDRIP because he promised he would, right? But now instead of saying like, oh, when are you gonna have justice for indigenous people, which is a huge vague term that means something different to anybody. Now you can say, when are you going to implement UNDRIP?
Right. Which is a set of rules, specific rules. It's all written down.
Exactly.
Is that why he went and talked about the indigenous peoples forever in his speech the other day?
I actually don't know. I know that he's been hammered a lot on it. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
He had a speech for the UN the other day. I think it was sort of, I don't know. I guess I don't know much about how the actual General Assembly goes. I guess everybody gets up and has a turn to talk about how things are going.
Whoever holds the conch, you get to hold the conch shell and then you get to talk. Yeah.
And like Donald Trump meandered and did his thing, and Justin Trudeau got up and he talked a lot about indigenous people and how we have a long way to go, and It was, good. Like, I listened and was like, great, okay.
Yeah.
But he got a lot of criticism from Canadians because people were like, what the fuck why are you talking about that? Why aren't you talking about refugees? Or why aren't you talking about stuff that, like, the UN deals with?
Yeah.
This is the criticism I read. And I felt like, yeah, but the UN doesn't vote for him. Like, Canadians vote for him, and Canadians want to hear him talk about indigenous people.
Yeah, well, and it's important to note, too, that in 2007... the only 4 countries that voted against UNDRIP are Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, a.k.a. the 4 countries with serious...
indigenous people.
Yeah, with like a serious history of colonial violence. And basically everything that UNDRIP says, don't do this, we did it all.
Right, and meanwhile, Britain was like...
yeah. They're like, oh, EastEnders is on. In the end, Canada came around and supported it, but we have been stalling the implementation of UNDRIP for a very long time and flapping your gums about how great indigenous people are, and then continuing to not implement UNDRIP is Canada's national sport after lacrosse, which is Canada's actual national sport, which is weird because I've literally never seen a lacrosse game in my life.
No, it's fine. It's violent.
It's like netball hockey.
Netball hockey. Yeah, violent, not popular. Played mostly by rich kids, I find.
Just like Canada.
Yeah, okay, cool. So we got the Security Council, we got the General Assembly, we have the
Economic and Social Council.
Yeah, Social Council,
and then finally the last part is the International Court of Justice.
International Court of Justice.
And all that is that's where all the legal stuff happens that is affected by the other stuff. So I should say too that the Economic and Social Council has 53 or something members, and it doesn't have vetoes like the other things do. Generally speaking, if there's a problem under the purview of the Economic and Social Council that requires intervention, that goes to the Security Council, right? The Security Council is where the shit happens.
Right.
But if the Security Council is all right, Jamie and Richard, figure the poop thing out, we go to the International Court of Justice, and that's where the shit happens. So that is, there's these judges, the lack of shit rather. Yeah. There's all these, judges appointed to it from all over the world who are experts in international law, and that's they're the people who would sit with us and be like, so Jamie, tell us about the poop problem,
right.
or whatever. That's me doing an African judge.
Yeah, I heard
that. Is that racism? Did I just make racism on this podcast?
I don't think so. Well, maybe.
Let's kick it up to the Security Council.
Yeah. We'll say that again. What's it called?
The International Court of Justice,
also known as the boring building.
yeah, that's right. It's the only building.
The House of Snores.
Yeah, it's the only part of the. This is the House of Snores right here, right now. Am I wrong? Hey, Dolores, how you doing, baby?
Yeah.
It's the only part of the UN that's not in New York. Everything else is in New York except the International Court of Justice, which is in The Hague in the Netherlands. Right. As we talked about last time. And
also known as the Assembly of Zoning Out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. The International Court of Boring. And so those are kind of the main functions of the UN. They do a million things, especially under the economic and social justice kind of thing. There's a bunch of different declarations. There's a bunch of different
well, they don't get a bunch of vetoes bouncing around. So it makes sense that they'll...
That's right.
That kind of stuff gets done a little bit more.
In that way, and they're also... Because they're also not doing concrete things, they're mostly information gathering, monitoring things,
Right.
giving priorities. They're kind of more like a think tank than like
so
than
like the
a
actual like
binding
action and
organization.
strong arming comes
Security
from the Security Council
100%.
all day.
And that's why
Right.
that's where the vetoes are, right?
Right.
Those countries would not agree to
being strong armed by other countries.
yeah, to some random countries being able to dictate to them what they would do.
Right.
That's their mentality.
Right. Isn't that what was the episode we were talking about that though? Like that's the point of signing a thing, you know, of
I think it was the
what were we talking
Truth and
about?
Reconciliation one or
Yeah,
something?
yeah. And like yeah, but like like I don't know. I guess I get it. I get it from a strategic point of view, like why it's good to like maintain your sort of sovereignty a little bit from that and maintain your independence. But also, you know, why don't you just isn't it good? Isn't it a good thing for everybody just to sign a piece of paper that says we are beholden to the UN and like, you know,
It's the hope. I
we
mean,
run
it's
the
the
world
hope.
together, man. You know, all for one.
Yeah. It's the fucking hope. I mean, like, honestly, in a just world, like, George W. Bush and Karl Rove would be in jail
Right.
for committing war crimes in Iraq. Like, ISIS is their fault
Mm-hmm.
for approving that stupid fight. Like, it's a, you know, but the United States will not allow its people to be beholden to international law. And it's a condition of their participation in stuff like this that they be able to get out at any time if they don't feel like they're being treated fairly. And for all of its problems, remember, the League of Nations, you had one job, and your one job was to prevent World War II, and you failed, right?
Right.
The United Nations had one job to prevent World War III. So far, it
It's-
has
it's
succeeded. And we had
succeeding.
some near fucking misses, but so far we've prevailed. And for better or for worse, the United Nations has been a factor in the relative lack of a huge global conflict that we've had in the last 70 years of human
Right.
history.
Wasn't there a moment where George Bush, I think while he was president, yeah, maybe Barack was president, but George Bush came to Canada and there was some sort of like legal obligation for them to arrest him or something like that. But like I remember
I think
being
people were trying to argue
Yeah.
that he should be arrested as a war criminal and like extradited. I don't think it happened.
no, it clearly didn't happen, and like I think even at the time, like people were like, "It's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
Like it'll never fucking happen in a million years."
It might have been Dick Cheney. I think it was when
Maybe.
Dick Cheney was coming to speak in Toronto, and people were trying to have him arrested, or there was like thought that he could legally be arrested
Right.
for some of the stuff that he had done. If you read my fanfiction.net account, there's a lot of writing about this, about Dick Cheney in prison.
You got fanfiction.net as a URL?
No, that's just a site where people write fanfiction.
Oh.
I had a roommate once who wrote fanfiction. And
Oh.
he was big on fanfiction.net.
Wow.
Yeah.
What kind of fanfiction did you write?
His
Give him a plug, man.
His fanfiction was a complete retelling of the entire story of Final Fantasy VII,
Whoa.
including all of the insane dialogue, line for line, that was badly translated from Japanese, and he justified all of it into this like big story.
Wow.
Yeah,
What's he doing now?
I don't know.
Writing Final Fantasy 16.
I assume he's still writing it. Yeah. That's right.
Cool.
Okay, well, I just got an alert from my computer saying that I'm almost out of space, so why don't we wrap this bad boy up?
Yeah, that seems like as good a time as any. Wow, Richard. The UN's amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
and
and
interesting.
what's-
Certainly flawed, but also I think probably a good step forward for us.
Yeah, I'm glad that we had this because now anytime we talk about the UN, we can refer back to this.
Mm-hmm.
It comes up all the time. And that's part of why it's hard to describe in one episode. It does a lot of things.
Right.
But now, the dynamic of the vetoes, the dynamic of the different nations who have power in it, that's a huge important part. So hopefully we can, that stays in your head as we go forward and you have that perspective into it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. If you have any questions, if you like this episode, if you didn't like this episode, if you have clarification, stuff you want us to hit, suggestions for future topics, you can get in touch with us at explaintojamie@gmail.com, on Twitter @explainjamie, on Instagram, SoundCloud, Facebook, Explain It to Jamie. We're on all of them. Come find us.
Yeah.
Leave us a review on iTunes, a good one, please.
Please, it
Please.
really helps out.
Please.
It helps out a lot.
Boosts our confidence and our relative rankings on the podcast list.
Yeah, it gets us on some lists we weren't on before.
Yeah.
This is great. Until next time, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
This has been Explain It to Jamie.